Hi, I'm Eric Schwartz. I'm the editor for Sociology and Cognitive Science here at Princeton University Press, and I'm joined by Skype with Rasmus Kleis Nielsen, who is the author of the new book, Ground Wars, Personalized Communication in Political Campaigns. Rasmus is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University, and he's also an assistant professor of communications at Roskilde University, which is in Denmark. So thanks for joining us today, Rasmus.
Thank you, Eric.
So, Rasmus, the title of your book is called Ground Wars, and it's about political campaigning. We're currently in a pretty heated campaign season here in the U.S. So my question for you is, first, what do we mean by ground war? What is a ground war in a campaign?
I mean, I realize it's a sort of slightly dramatic title, if you will. The term will be instantly recognizable to people who have worked on political campaigns in the U.S., even though it might be opaque to those who haven't. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for forms of political communication that rely on people serving as media, so what I call personalized communication. So the typical examples would be canvassing, knocking on doors, walking door to door to talk to voters about politics. Another typical example of this is phone banking, so those calls you get when election day approaches, where people who are volunteering or working for campaigns will call you to try to persuade you to vote in a certain way or to remind you to go out and vote. And the distinction, if you will, that sort of gives rise to the metaphor is between the so-called air war, to use another dramatic metaphor, that is fought out between campaigns using television, so television advertising, versus then this sort of more down in the trenches ground war that's fought out from door to door, door knock by door knock, phone call by phone call.
So, Rasmus, we often hear about the air war, I think, is what we tend to hear about in the media, in terms of raising money, campaigns, raising money so that they can make large television buys. What is it about the ground war that's different than the air war? I mean, what is the value of this interpersonal dimension of the campaign?
Well, it's true that the dominant narrative, if you will, about American politics, both in journalistic coverage but also in how we teach political science in universities and colleges, is one that's focused on television and news coverage. And both of those forms of communication are very, very important. I mean, still today, campaigns spend most of their money on television advertising. I mean, news, of course, plays an important role, in particular at the presidential level. But the thing that I'm interested in, and that my book deals with, is the resurgence, if you will, of this sort of seemingly old-fashioned form of communication that involves knocking on doors. So when you're at the receiving end of this knock, it may seem like nothing much has changed. That this is, your parents or your grandparents' generations forms of old-fashioned political communication that just sort of a remnant, if you will, a leftover from mid-20th century forms of campaigning. But really what has happened in the last 10, 15 years is that this form of communication has become resurgent and is really being reinvented as we speak by political operatives who are combining this very intimate, close and personal form of contact that involves sending someone to speak to the voter with a whole slew of new technologies for targeting voters, for contacts, and for organizing campaign efforts. And really, I mean, the growth is quite extraordinary. I mean, if you look at the survey data we have available, for most of the post-war period, from the 50s till the 90s, about a quarter of the electorate and of the adult voting age population would report that they were contacted personally by the parties and campaigns in the run-up to an election. But the last 10 years, from 2000 onward, this number has grown very, very dramatically. So in the last two presidential elections in 2008 and 2004, more than 40% of the adult population has been contacted in this fashion. And just to give some context on that, I mean, in addition to this being an awful lot of people, to use a technical term, if you will, we're talking about something in the region of 100 million people. When you count in the interest groups and others who also talk to voters about politics, 42%, that's the number of people who in 2008 report that they have been contacted in person by parties or candidates. that's a higher percentage than people who report getting political news from television. Wow. It's a higher percentage than the number of people who report getting political news from the internet. It's a higher percentage of people than the percentage of people who report getting news from newspapers. So, of course, in the long run, television still reaches more people than door-to-door or phone banking, but we're talking very serious, very large numbers of people who are contacted in this personalized fashion today.
So, yeah, you had mentioned that you know, this is a kind of classic style of campaigning. It's something that, you know, our people of our grandparents' generation would recognize. And it clearly, as you just described, it's enormously pervasive. It's something that we all experience. Who's orchestrating this, and what kind of what can they do to make it effective? How do they know that they're knocking on the right doors or going to the right blocks? Are these kinds of decisions made ahead of time?
Well, first, in terms of who's organizing this, I mean, the focus in coverage of political campaigns is very much on the sort of the top political operatives, the campaign managers, the Carl Roves and David Ploughs of the world. And they are very much involved in planning this in terms of thinking through with almost a military precision from the very outset, you know, years in advance. How do we manage to build the capacity to contact all these people that we want to talk to, and how do we find ways of targeting it? But of course, if you think about it, this is very, very labor intensive. The rule of thumb is that you can talk to something like 3 people every hour you spend walking door to door or calling people on the phones. So if you're talking about reaching more than 40% of the American population, this is very, very labor intensive. So to be able to do this, campaigns trying to mobilize much larger groups of people, both in terms of allied organizations, like the Democrats who rely on labor unions. Republicans are often relying on Christian conservative activist groups and increasingly today on Tea Party libertarian groups, but also paid people who do this for $10 an hour, knocking on doors as a casual job, if you will. And it takes thousands of people, tens of thousands, and at the presidential level, hundreds of thousands or even millions of people to get this work done. So that's sort of one side of it in terms of who organizes it. Well, it starts from the top, but it relies on people, and this is something that's very distinct about personalized political communication in contrast to mass-mediated, more sort of air war-style communication that fundamentally, because it's about people serving as media, it's very labor-intensive, and it means that the campaigns have to get many more people involved to be able to do this, either as volunteers or doing it as casual labor. In terms of how do you know this works, well, I'd be happy to, of course, highlight work of sort of fellow social scientists. There are some great people at Yale and other places who've done experimental work on testing the immediate impact of a knock on the door or a phone call of turning people out to vote and increasing electoral participation, if you will. But of course, the ones who have the most at stake in finding out whether this works that's the parties and the candidates and the interest groups who do this themselves on a very large scale and spend a lot of money doing it. So political organizations of various sorts have coordinated very large-scale experimental research, trying to contact some groups of voters, not others, measuring very carefully the impact of this. And they're helped in all this by using the same technologies that they use to target this when they do it during the election season. They have access to voter files, the profiles of most voting-age Americans that they can use to target this form of contact. And then, of course, when they do it experimentally, then to compare groups who have been contacted with those who haven't. And all the work we have in this area suggests very clearly that with differences depending on how well this is done in terms of the message and the quality of the conversation itself, how well trained people are, and so on, that this in general, this has a clear impact on people's electoral participation.
So when you get that knock at the door, chances are that person who is knocking at your door knows a little bit more about you than you know about them.
That's for sure. I mean, at the very least, they'll know your name, they'll know your age, they'll know your gender, whether you have a party affiliation as a registered voter or not. They'll probably know your phone number. Of course, they know your address if they knock on your door. All this data that parties have from voter files that they acquire and accumulate in large databases that they maintain and have maintained for years now And then often the people who do the sort of the statistical analysis that select certain segments of the population for contacts will often know a great deal more than that. So they will have acquired information from various consumer information companies about your personal finances, perhaps, whether you're in debt, about magazine subscriptions and other stuff that they use to try to analyze your likely political sympathies and whether you're likely to vote or not. And then, of course, the campaigns themselves, in addition to suing the ground war as a means of communicating with voters and potential voters, it's also a giant information collecting exercise. And the parties store this data. So if you've ever tried this yourself, at being contacted by a canvasser or someone on the phones from one of the political parties, in addition to making a pitch to you, they'll often ask you, who do you plan to vote for? What are the most important issues for you? And all this data is now stored so that the parties will have information not only on what you said when someone called you a month ago about the upcoming election, but also if they talked to you 2 years ago during the midterm elections or 4 years ago during the last presidential election, have that information too, and use it in statistical analysis to try to predict, A, how likely are you to vote in this election? So should they try to mobilize you to get out or not? And B, who are you most likely to vote for? Because obviously they are only interested in turning you out as a voter if they think you are likely to vote for them, and they're only likely to try to contact you and persuade you if they think there's actually some significant probability that you might be, as they call it, persuadable.
Mm-hmm. So and something that you and I were talking about a little bit earlier today is that the campaigns that are really well funded. We often hear about, certainly in the 2008 election, we heard about Obama's great, ground game and the operation that he had in the field. We certainly are seeing that in terms of Mitt Romney relative to Newt Gingrich or Rick Santorum. The Romney campaign has been much better funded for a much longer amount of time and have established headquarters in various different places. So the campaigns, in this sense, then, when they establish that the ground war is both, I guess, on the one hand, an information gathering, information gathering tool, but it also is a mobilization tool. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a very complex machinery that's being built anew, and every campaign will have to try to piece together some assistance they will get from the party organization, some assistance they might get from local allies of various sorts, but also have to mobilize their own resources to do this. And there's a lot of sort of back-end work that's largely invisible to us as voters, and even for people who follow politics quite closely. It's not covered in great detail by journalists, which is about how do you build the organizational capacity to engage with potential volunteers, with staying in touch with them, getting them involved, with targeting your contacts, building up the capacity. Even if you hire people to do this for money, of course, you still have to manage them, send them out, get them to knock on those doors, collect the information, so on and so forth. And sometimes sort of personalized political communications portrayed as sort of a grassroots campaigning, if you will, something that enthusiastic party activists will get engaged in, but really not a game that's sort of made in terms of professionals. That's profoundly mistaken. When this is done well, this is dependent on professional expertise, specialized expertise in targeting. It's dependent on the hard work of field organizers, very long hours and very hard to make sure that all of this is working out. And of course, it takes money. I mean, you'll have to have campaign offices, you'll have to have phone lines, you'll have to have access to the data that the parties collate. And some of this stuff can be eased, if you will, or helped along with using social media. And today there are talks of distributed phone banks, for instance, so you can log on to the website of Freedom Works or one of the other Tea Party-affiliated political action committees and make phone calls from home without necessarily speaking to a field organizer. But there is still a large back-end infrastructure that has to be built and maintained, and that's largely done by professionals working for political parties or for large interest groups.
Mm-hmm. It's actually a really interesting point, so that we have a tendency, I think, to think about the ground war in the terms of the volunteers, but the actual campaigns themselves and the parties themselves think about this in terms of the infrastructure. And is the infrastructure? I mean, certainly the data that they're gathering is usable for future campaigns. is the infrastructure that they create, is that usable, or is this something that comes into existence once the campaign begins? It's used through the course of the campaign, and then as soon as that campaign is over, it goes into a puff of smoke. Is that accurate, or what happens to the apparatus?
Well, I mean, some of the expertise will stay around in terms of people who have worked on one campaign cycle will have accumulate experience and will work on the next campaign cycle. But of course, many people will enter and leave the political world, go on to do other things, and not necessarily work the same cycle. The data, too, it will be collected by the parties, but some of these things are institutionalized and durable, but every campaign will have to reassemble, if you will, the resources that they need to pursue an effective ground war. And I think we've seen this very, very clearly, actually, when just sort of thinking back about the last couple of presidential elections. The campaign apparatus that Karl Rove and his affiliates built around the candidacy of George W. Bush in 2000, 2004 was very, very, very impressive, very professional, managed to mobilize a lot of volunteers and wage very effective campaigns. In fact, it was so effective that some political journalists, a couple of Washington Post political journalists, wrote a book called One Party Country about how the Republicans had managed to fashion a machinery that would permanently, or at least for the long term, marginalize the Democratic Party. Now, we all know what happened after that, and that's not to knock the analysis of those journalists. It's just to illustrate that actually it turns out these machineries may not be as durable as they are sometimes presented as, even though the expertise, of course, lives on, and even though the data still lives on and can be reassembled. Because John McCain found it very hard to reconstruct, if you will, that machinery that had served George W. Bush so well. There wasn't the same kind of volunteer enthusiasm around his candidacy. The big funders that had backed George W. Bush were not necessarily fully committed to his candidacy, perhaps sensing that he might not win. But of course, we've seen the same thing happen around Obama. When Barack Obama built this extraordinary campaign that was built around him by his people, and the extraordinary outpouring of volunteer support and small dollar donations that fueled his candidacy in 2008, this too led to speculation that this had provided the president with campaign machinery that he could then use after Election Day to sort of bludgeon Congress into submission, if you will. There was this idea that what was transformed into this political organization called Organizing for America, the remnants of the Obama for America organization, would be a tremendous tool for the president, not just in terms of campaigning, but also in terms of governing. Now, of course, it's not that it didn't work at all. They did generate some calls, actually quite a lot of calls to wavering moderate Democrats in the fight around healthcare, for instance. But it wasn't nearly on the scale that some people had thought it would be. And really, I think it's quite clear for the people running the re-election campaign for the president now that one of their major challenges is not simply building a new campaign, but rebuilding, if you will, from reconnecting with the people who were involved last time, and really sort of re-energizing that network and that group of activists and whatnot, and then combining it with new forms of technological targeting and organizing that have been developed in the meantime.
I think that's actually a great point. I think for that, which we could end, which is in the end that what matters most is the people. That the campaign, that having that infrastructure isn't enough. That in the end, you need to have the people to participate in the campaign who are interested and motivated.
Yeah, everything matters. I mean, the infrastructure certainly matters, but the infrastructure isn't enough. I mean, you can have all the organizers and all the data in the world, but you fundamentally need people to animate this machinery and to generate the capacity to contact all those voters. Some of that you can buy, but really, there are limits unless you have absolutely phenomenal amounts of money available to buy highly trained sort of telemarketing types to do this. There are limits to what you buy. John Corson in New Jersey, for instance, in his re-election campaign for governor, there was, shall we say, a lull in volunteer support for his candidacy, and his campaign had to rely largely on paid people to do their canvassing and phone banking. And it's not easy to find enough people to do that if you're paying $10 an hour. Actually, they had to bus in homeless people from neighboring Pennsylvania to get enough buddies on the street. That's not necessarily going to work as well, to put it mildly, as sort of having indigenized volunteers. And of course, that's a real resource that campaigns today are sort of rediscovering, if you will, and hence also pursuing with renewed vigor, really trying again, if they think they have any shot at it at all, to get people involved in in highly instrumental, but still genuine forms of political participation that are about communicating with voters on behalf of candidates and campaigns.
And in the end, it's all about making sure that those voters come out and vote on Election Day.
Absolutely. I mean, all the votes in the world are not going to make any difference if they don't actually cast that vote for you on Election Day. So that's what the ground war is in large part about, is getting out those voters.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, Rasmus. It's been great to speak with you. Once again, the book here, Ground Wars, Rasmus Kleis Nielsen. Thank you very much. We'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you.